BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
It's not often that a dispute between a restaurant and its landlord makes headlines around the world. In fact, perhaps it's never happened until now.
Veeraswamy, UK's oldest Indian restaurant, is at risk of closing just months before its centenary. Established in 1926 near Piccadilly Circus, the Michelin-starred eatery faces eviction due to
because of a dispute with its landlord, who happens to be the king. Michelin-star.
Let me tell you that this restaurant isn't just an ordinary place to eat. It opened way back in 1926 and has been serving delicious Indian food for almost 100 years right in the heart of London.
From Chaplin dining here with Gandhi and catering to the late Queen, as well as hosting Hollywood legends like Elizabeth Taylor and Marlon Brando, Veeraswamy is a London gastronomic institution with a Michelin star to boot.
More on the Veeraswamy story later, because I think the possible closure of a gastronomic institution approaching its centenary begs a wider and I think more interesting set of questions, such as when does a restaurant become an institution? And in a fast-moving industry led by trends, how do some restaurants manage to survive across generations? And perhaps the most important question of all, why should we care? To one of the most influential of all restaurateurs and reinventor of historic restaurants, such as the Ivy and Simpson's Jeremy King, these institutions matter because they've helped shape history.
In my opinion, if you consider any of the great, particularly 20th century movements in art or music or literature, politics even, just about all of them had their genesis in a Grand Cafe or a brasserie or that sort of feel of place. And they are at the heart of the culture, and they're the meeting place. They're the opportunity for discussion and dissent, and the most creative places. One of the fundamental things which is changing is that there's a homogenization of how restaurants appear and feel, and how many have poured concrete floors, plain white painted walls, open ceilings, terrible acoustics, very little longevity.
Before we hear more from Jeremy King, let's delve deeper into the world of historic restaurants and pay a visit to a selection of fascinating places, all with stories to tell. We begin in the birthplace of the modern restaurant.
So this is really it. This was the centre of Paris, and this is where you had 15 restaurants, 20 cafes, 18 gambling rooms.
Our guide in Paris is Caroline Boyd, award-winning food writer and author of Amuse-Bouche, How to Eat Your Way Around France. Our starting point is the Palais Royal, close to the Louvre, a place of royalty, revolution and restaurant origins.
And this is where all their life happened, and all these incredible figures from French culinary history were here. So Brillat Savarin, Guillemot de la Reynière, Balzac. So this is where it was all happening, really at the start of the restaurant, when people began to sit at a table, order from a menu, eat their individual dishes with a knife and fork, and that's how restaurants really started to take hold.
Just one historic restaurant has survived in the arcades of the Palais Royal, Le Grand Véfour, which opened in the 1780s. Step through the front door and it feels like you're inside an ornate jewellery box. There are mirrors, chandeliers and walls filled with frescoes, the imagery of which tells stories of food and drink.
Et là aussi, par exemple, ici, vous voyez, tout est fait vraiment dans le détail. Tout à l'heure, on avait des cèpes de vigne.
Guy Martin has been head chef at Le Grand Véfour since 1991, and we're standing in front of one of the classical-style frescoes featuring a woman surrounded by wheat.
Mais quand il y a du pain, quand les gens ont du pain, il y a à manger.
I think this is the best art gallery dedicated to food I've ever been in.
It really is.
La table de Colette, là c'est la table de Bonaparte, Napoléon.
As Guy looks around the room, he starts to point at different tables. The diners who sat here include Napoleon and Josephine, Colette, Victor Hugo, Balzac, Jean-Paul Sartre, Maria Callas and Jean Cocteau.
Il faut savoir que Colette et Cocteau, ils habitaient à côté et ils venaient pratiquement tous les jours.
Guy explains the entire restaurant has the official status of a historic monument, one of the few restaurants in Paris to do so. As the king's residence was nearby, the Palais Royal was at the heart of everything. And following the revolution, the cooks who'd worked for the aristocracy reinvented themselves as chefs, serving food alongside other attractions.
Donc, ils ont commencé à ouvrir.
Here, there were theatres, a circus, gambling houses, and brothels. In the post-revolutionary Palais Royal were rooms in which there might be a side of beef or terrines on offer, like a buffet. And then later, table seating and menus arrived.
Par exemple, faire des bouillons, faire des soupes.
This is how Le Grand Véfour started out in 1784. As Paris was a crossing point for so many different cultures, not only from within France but other parts of the world, people arrived in the city to trade different ingredients such as spices. And so in these emerging restaurants, there was also huge culinary creativity, the legacy of which can be seen on the menu today. There are still terrines and beef, along with eclairs and profiteroles, but also more modern fish and meat dishes.
C'est une base solide pour après.
We ask Guy if it feels like a huge responsibility to look after centuries of restaurant history. It's as if Le Grand Véfour is like a house, he says, with deep foundations. All he can do is to take great care in building on those foundations.
Yeah, so in the evening when the lights have gone down outside and you're just in here by candlelight, it's like nothing else on earth. You can be sitting here in the same spirit of all these people who've sat here before, Balzac and Colette and Victor Hugo and all these people who are sitting in their sort of with their ghosts almost, you know, and that's something you can't find in many places.
Le Grand Véfour is a historic monument because of its building and location, but a 30-minute metro ride north are historic restaurants that have preserved classic French cooking. Today, Les Halles is a busy district filled with offices, shops and cafes. But until the 1970s, this was home to Paris's most important wholesale market.
So in 1857, Les Halles, as we came to know it, that's when that opened with these 12 pavilions designed by the architect Baltard. And that's when you would find a different product in each of the halls. So there would have been a cheese hall, there would have been a fish hall, and it was just full of people. So this was the setting for Émile Zola's The Belly of Paris, and his descriptions of all the different products in that incredible work is just phenomenal. He returns to Paris having been sent to a penal colony for several years. So he arrives starving, poor, not a penny to his name, and he arrives having been picked up by a vegetable merchant on the road from the gutter, basically from the verge, and arrives on a pile of cabbages into the middle of Les Halles. And the first chapter of Le Belly of Paris is these incredible descriptions of this starving man's experience of this abundance, literally the belly of Paris that was literally feeding the city. Lettuces, endive, chicory open and with rich soil still clinging to their roots, exposed their swelling hearts, bunches of spinach, sorrel and artichokes, piles of peas and beans, mounds of cos lettuces tied up with straw. Sounded every note on the scale of greens, from the lacquered green of the pods to the coarse green of the leaves. Continuous scale of rising and falling notes that died away in the mixed tones of the tufts of celery and the bundles of leeks. But the highest notes at the very top of the scale came from the bright carrots and snowy turnips scattered in tremendous quantities throughout the markets, which they lit up with their medley of colours.
And unsurprisingly, that history of a food market and the riches that really emerged in the 19th century, there would have been so many restaurants around here because of that. They would have been on the doorstep of the ingredients on their menus.
Yes, exactly that. But they were more to feed the workers. The restaurant, the bistros all around this space would have been feeding the workers all hours of the night. So they would arrive often, very early hours or late in the day with products from the market to give to the chef, maybe in part exchange for their meal. This is why in those restaurants you get sort of cheap cuts of meat, so tripe, and that's where the dish French onion soup comes from. So it's just in a simple broth, like a beef broth or a chicken broth. So in the late 60s, the traffic and the sort of logistics of delivering to a market in the centre of Paris just became too unwieldy. So they moved it out to Rungis, which is like the size of a small country now on the outskirts of Paris. And that's when this area started to become something else, really. Like, it became a shopping centre, quite a dreary shopping centre to start with, and they've revamped it in the last few years now.
But the legacy continues somewhat with some of the historic restaurants here.
Yeah, a lot of the restaurants and the bistros that fed the workers and the people coming here would have closed down in the 60s and 70s, but there's a few that remain, like the Pierre de Cochon and Chez Denise, where we're going next, and they continue despite there not being a market here, but they're still selling the same things on the menus that people would have been eating in those centuries of the market. Bonjour.
One of the restaurants that survived the market closure is Chez Denise. We arrived at lunchtime to meet the current owner, Alain Grandier.
Chez Denise, la propriétaire.
Alain had been a butcher and a customer of Chez Denise. It was an institution, he says, and had everything he loved about restaurants. The first time he stepped inside, it was like walking into someone's home. It was a place where you could sit and talk to strangers who had become friends. And when the previous owner retired in 2020, he took over the restaurant. Alain told us that during the market's heyday, Chez Denise was a bar into which butchers would bring cuts of meat that would be cooked for them as they sat and drank. And this took place throughout the night. As a restaurant, Chez Denise opened for a few hours for lunch, and then in the evening it served the market workers, opening at 8 at night and staying open until 8 in the morning. And as the restaurant was located on the side where the meat hall of Les Halles was, it was one of the favourite haunts of butchers and tripe sellers. When the market moved in 1969, other night workers took over as the main customers, including policemen and taxi drivers who'd mingle with other Parisians. But what they ate remained the legacy of the meat market, with dishes such as mutton and haricot beans, lamb's brains and tripe. The paintings on the walls of the restaurant also show a different side of the history of Les Halles, capturing the famous people who frequented the restaurants of the area, from artists such as David Bowie to politicians including Jacques Chirac. When Alain took over the restaurant, the interior hadn't been changed for 60 years. People wanted it to be kept that way. But when the pandemic came, and with it lockdowns, he started to refurbish just a bit. Regulars would pop their heads in to check that he hadn't changed too much. To them, this was a special place, and he felt a responsibility for that to continue. One customer who stepped inside during that time pointed to a table and said he'd once spent 48 hours there, eating, drinking, talking, and a little sleeping. It was a different time back then, says Alain. But there's a spirit that continues here. Or think of it as a soul, he said. This is a restaurant where time doesn't exist, where trends don't matter. That's why Chez Denise has survived.
Le 15 mars 2020, qu'on a été fermé. Voilà. À l'époque, l'affaire, ça a travaillé du lundi.
Alain Grandier, talking with me and Caroline Boyd, author of Amuse-Bouche, How to Eat Your Way Around France. From Paris, let's head to London's West End. And just off of Regent Street, I'm looking at a plaque on a wall.
1916 Bill Bentley's, long-standing purveyor of oysters in Mayfair in the West End. Because we're in the back of Mayfair here, although it seems more Soho, believe it or not, we're on the last triangle of Mayfair in here into Piccadilly.
I'm with chef Richard Corrigan, who just over 20 years ago took over a London institution, Bentley's on Swallow Street, which first opened in 1916. The building is the same, and the menu remains rooted in the restaurant's origins. Oysters.
What is Bentley's? Bentley's is a family business. The Bentley family were oyster farmers, and they decided in 1516 really, to come into London. The Great War had started. I would imagine shifting oysters was quite difficult, so they were looking for customers, they were looking for business, they were looking for customers, and they opened a shop here next door, and they supplied the shop then, they supplied the Ritz and the Savoy. So Bentley's was not just an oyster bar, it was a shop, and people delivered all over London from the oyster bar, from the oyster shop next door, still called the shop next door, where we do all our fish prep. And it has a few sacrosanct, I think, things about Bentley's. We don't let chefs touch oysters in Bentley's. That's why we have oyster barmen, and that's the only food they do. We would not allow a chef to go near an oyster.
It's a specialism.
Because they know by lifting up the oyster if it's bad or good. That's, Freddie and the team will know that. They know by just a click how it opens that it's not good, and it disappears into a bin before a customer will ever see it. And the only thing I can say, you need to be shifting a lot of oysters to really run a good oyster bar. You need to have an amazing output of oysters going across the counter, and they're open fresh every day, not to be kept in fridges. Oysters hate fridges. And people put them in, they pack them in, they put them in cold fridges and cold rooms. They should never see a cold room. They come in, they get delivered, they put up here, they're sold. And we have plenty on the menu, and when things are sold out, they're sold out.
Yeah. But that is a link back to the very origins, the beginnings of Bentley's.
Yeah.
Joining me on this mini tour of London's historic restaurants is journalist and now restaurant manager Joe Warwick.
Well, I think actually in London, there's very few restaurants with the kind of heritage that Bentley's has got. We've actually got one down the road who's in trouble at the moment, Veeraswamy. I don't know what it is about London compared with, say, Paris, that there's so few places like this that have been here a century. So it's that kind of, restaurants are living, breathing things, and of course new fashionable places are fun and great, but the places that people go back to tend to be those places that have got tradition, that feel special, and they feel special because they've got all that history.
A key feature of most historic restaurants is that they're in private hands, mostly family owned, and taking care of Bentley today is its managing director, Richard Corrigan's son, Richard Jr.
William Bentley in 1916, or Bill Bentley, they originally were kind of from an oyster farmer family. I think he had kind of grand ideas of being an actor. Unfortunately, it didn't work out. Like anyone, he kind of, realized, what they're good at and what they can do well is, sell their oysters and sell them to his friends who were actors and who were on stage, and a bit of a hangout. You're still in that cultural hangout without being an actor. And that's how it started. We've got pictures on the wall of William Bentley, and you can see how he looks and how he dresses. You would have thought he was an actor, not an oyster farmer or a restaurateur. And it's so great. No matter what kind of menu you take, whether it's from the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, you see the native oysters, the rock oysters, and your crabs done 4 or 5 ways back then, and your soles done 5 ways. And I've seen a dish that was like the Bentley sole. And it was it's bonkers. It's like, it's like cockles, mussels, crab, lobster. It's like, sole no man plus. Sherry, white wine, champagne sauce. And you're just like, it's like how they ate back then was brilliant.
From what you've seen of the history and the records, if Bill Bentley walked in today, would he recognise the restaurant? Would he recognise the menu?
I think the family have given us the seal of approval. When it was sold in 1977, the family came back for a bite to eat, and it certainly wasn't unsung. And they weren't seen again since we bought it, I'll be honest with you. And a couple of years into our ownership of it, this is over 20 years ago, the family came back and they wrote to Richard about, we feel Bentley's is in proper hands again. And they recognised it. They recognised what a freshly picked crab is, and a beautiful oyster, and the passion that goes into the whole thing.
It's beautiful. It's just a very, very nice letter to say, thanks for taking care of us. It's great to see the restaurant, up and running. It's a very proud moment for the family, and I think that's from a family that run it now. It's a really nice family to family moment, and they know that what we're doing is we want to preserve the name and the legacy of Bentley's.
A 5-minute walk away, there's another plaque. This one marks an even older restaurant, and reflecting London's restaurant history, its origins also can be found in the world of oysters.
Hello, my name's Jason Phillips. I'm the director of Wilton's Restaurant on Jermyn Street. You'll see it's a green plaque. Most people are quite familiar with the blue plaques, and they're for people that have actually passed away, and it's sort of recognising the fact that they lived in that establishment. The green plaques are actually provided by the council, and they're not just for people, but they're also for businesses, and they're recognising businesses that have contributed to the local area. So we were very fortunate. We were awarded ours probably 6 years ago, and it takes pride of place underneath the Wilton sign.
Not many restaurants with a green plaque.
I don't think there are very many restaurants, and I think one of the other things, as we'll see as we go into the restaurant, Wilton's has 6 royal warrants. That were awarded to the restaurant between 1838 and 1938. So again, another little uniqueness that Wilton's has that's, again, not found in many other restaurants.
And while we're standing here with the green sign, and this name is in front of us, George William Wilton. Can you tell us the origin story?
So George William Wilton decided to open up an oyster barrow. He wanted to sell oysters and cockles and seafood in the Haymarket, which was in those days a market that sold straw and hay, probably for the sheep that were being sold in Shepherd's Market round the corner. After a while, they decided to move the oyster barrow into what would have been called oyster rooms. And this would have been a vacant shop that would be empty, and it would simply be very, very basic. It would be a counter at the end, with the oyster barrow at the end. It would have been tables, and it would have been a very, very simple fare. And as this sort of evolved over a period of time, they would have started introducing other dishes, not just oysters. They would have been doing fish. They would have probably had a fish tank in there. And this is where it gets a little bit contentious, because Wilton started off in 1742, but is considered the second oldest restaurant in London. Rules is considered the oldest restaurant in London because it received its liquor license in 1798, whereas Wilton's received their liquor license in 1840, 42 years after Rules. So we're quite happy to accept that Rules is the oldest restaurant in London. Wilton's is the oldest trading fishmongers, and we're very happy with that. That's legacy, I should say.
Like Bentley's, Wilton's is family-owned, in the hands of the Hambro family since the 1940s. But whereas Bentley's has remained in one location, Wilton's has moved multiple times. But one of the restaurant's most famous features, rows of intimate booths, have been transplanted from its former home.
Okay, so here we are. We're standing in front of one of the famous Wilton's booths. You can see that they're very comfortable, and I'll just point up on the right-hand side. You can see in the mirror there, etched in, we have Berry Street written full to see.
You're kind of in the room, but at the same time tucked away and isolated, I suppose. Were these lifted wholesale from the previous restaurant? So they just basically took them apart, reassembled them?
Yes, they took them out, reassembled them, and then fortunately we managed to, they fitted, we had the right space.
And it's the green, because I've noticed the uniforms are green, yes, and the green velvet below. Green's always been your colour?
Green is the Wilton's colour, absolutely. And I referred to the staff that work here and the management here. We genuinely see ourselves as custodians. We want to pass the restaurant on to the next generation with all the values that we've fought and strived to maintain.
As we've reported in previous editions of the food programme, and following budget announcements, the restaurant business is getting tougher. And historic restaurants aren't immune to financial pressures or the end of a lease, which brings us back to Veeraswamy, London's first and longest surviving Indian restaurant, which, as it approaches its centenary, is facing closure. Over to its current owner.
I'm Ranjit Mithrani. Its first major owner who created it was William Stewart, a Conservative MP, who was passionate about food, he passionate about the culture, passionate about artifacts, passionate about chefs, and he sold the business in about 1963.
Wasn't the food was much more Anglo-Indian to begin with, I believe?
Yes, because Veeraswamy started off its life with pure Indian food, but then I think the owners quickly realized that the better halves, the women, actually did not have the same interests as the male counterparts. in Indian food because the mail counterparts were often the generals, the soldiers, the civil servants who were coming back from India on holiday and wanted their fix of spice. So they very cleverly divided the menu into two, which was Indian and, quotes, continental. And so they had the left half was Indian and the right half was classic French fare. And then in mid-50s, I think by the time it got the tandoor, Veeraswamy was the first restaurant in Britain to have tandoor.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
It brought the tandoor in. And at that stage, I think they took the plunge and became all, as you said, India, Desi, Indian.
Yeah. And then the other story I came across that tickled me was the possibility that this tradition of drinking lager with Indian food is connected to Veeraswamy, not the restaurant itself, but when they did the exhibition, because you had the Prince of Denmark, Prince Axel of Denmark brought Carlsberg with him.
Well, what happened was that the Prince of Denmark used to come here and eat at Veeraswamy once or twice a year. And he insisted that, I think a barrel of Carlsberg beer sent across here for his sole consumption when he was here. And out of that, for better or for worse, you had the tradition of beer with Indian food.
The fate of Veeraswamy is in the hands of the Crown Estate. They've told us the building, Victory House, is in need of renovation and the restaurant can't stay. In a statement, they say, "We appreciate how upsetting this is for Veeraswamy and have offered help to find premises elsewhere." Veeraswamy's owners say forcing it out will result in the death of an important and historic restaurant. And so they've launched a petition as part of their campaign to save it. But the closure of historic restaurants isn't just a feature of the contemporary London restaurant scene. Let's head to the US. There, historic restaurants have also been disappearing. Helping to tell that story is Yale history professor Paul Friedman, the author of 10 Restaurants That Changed America, and most of the 10 no longer exist.
What strikes me is that so many of them were founded almost by accident, or at least they were founded deliberately, but their success was almost by accident. In the last 30, 40 years, most restaurants are created with investors and with a study of the market and geographical location. They may be successful or not, but whatever, they're very well thought out.
One of the rare survivors is in New Orleans. It's called Antoine's.
It was founded in 1840, and not only has it endured, but it is in the same family. It was created by a very young man who immigrated to America, who founded it as a French restaurant. But in part because of the gastronomic riches of New Orleans and the Gulf of Mexico and the difficulty of reproducing some of the ingredients from France, it really became what they now call high-end Creole. That is to say, French-inspired food, but with New Orleans traditions of spicing, of ingredients, fish like pompano, soft-shell crabs, or for a while, turtles. He had a kind of a bouillabaisse that actually William Makepeace Thackeray praised. So this restaurant and others in New Orleans have survived. There are a lot of, probably a greater density or number, certainly per capita, of venerable restaurants in New Orleans than anywhere else. And it's partly that New Orleans, even in the darkest days of American gastronomy, which would be Prohibition to the 1970s, was a gastronomic destination. People would go there for all sorts of reasons, but you hadn't been to New Orleans unless you tried one of these classic restaurants. It's very large, and it has something over a dozen rooms. It was an anchor of New Orleans society, and that was one reason for its success. People would boast a sign of status was that you had your own waiter. The way you made reservations was with your waiter, and every time you came there, you had the same waiter. And so to have a waiter at Antoine's was a mark of social success.
And Paul, when you were researching stories for the book, did you figure out why some historic restaurants survive?
I think that some of the reasons why people love them, and therefore why they are able to perpetuate themselves, some of it just has to do with things like real estate. They own the building, for example. At least this is true in New York, but at least you have a very long tenure at a predictable rate. But even more than that, I would say it's, in a way, the opposite of innovation. It's the opposite of adaptation. As with Antoine's, yes, you may have to adapt to dress codes or to, including some vegetarian dishes. But people go to the Tour d'Argent for the pressed duck. You can't say, you know what, I'm tired of the pressed duck. We're not going to serve that anymore. Or, Delmonico's has to have lobster Newburgh. Or you couldn't imagine rules just deciding, beef prices are too high and we're gonna reinvent ourselves as a vegetarian restaurant. It's not predictability, because you can have predictability and fail. It's the association of a certain kind of experience. The experience may include the decor, the service, but it's got to include the actual kind of food that is served. So Antoine's, to get back to that, has an oyster dish called Oysters Rockefeller. The secret to the sauce that it's cooked with, these are cooked oysters, which are popular in the United States. It's a green sauce. The owner told me that he knows the recipe and one other person in case he dies suddenly. But that's it. That extreme is not found everywhere. But that's what Antoine's is known for. Lots of places serve some kind of version of this, but nevertheless, this is part of what has led to their incredible longevity.
A unique menu can also explain the survival of one of China's historic restaurants. Here's Fuchsia Dunlop with the surprising story of a restaurant founded in 1897 by a German entrepreneur.
So I'm taking you to Shanghai, to the old international settlement, to a restaurant called Deda Xichan Shi, which means something like the Great German Western Food Restaurant. Visiting Deda is a bit like walking back into the early 20th century. So it's an old vintage building, and inside it's decked out in early 20th century European style. So there's wooden paneling, quite heavy European style wooden furniture. There's a bakery downstairs serving creamy, fluffy sponge cakes and palmiers, which is a favorite local snack. And upstairs in the main dining room, there's a wood-paneled ceiling and again, this sort of heavy upholstery. But the menu is all European, and there are no chopsticks, there are no Chinese ingredients in the kitchen. And the restaurant's signature dishes are a really interesting hodgepodge of influences from all over the place. So there are German cured meats with sauerkraut and potatoes, which is a reference to the original German owner. There's also a very popular losungtang, which is Chinese for Russian soup. So it's a local version of borscht made with tomatoes rather than beetroot. And it's a sweetish tomato soup with bits of beef and potato and cabbage floating around in it. And there's also a Russian potato salad with potato and peas and carrots in mayonnaise. And these dishes both come from the White Russians who flocked here after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. And there's also Portuguese baked chicken, which is chicken in a cheesy bechamel sauce with curry flavourings. And also the restaurant is known for its steaks and a pork schnitzel, which is served with a locally produced version of English Worcester sauce, which they call la jiangyou, hot soy sauce.
And just to be clear, Fuchsia, this is a restaurant for locals. Despite the Western menu, it's not catering for tourists.
So these days in Shanghai, there's all kinds of contemporary, cutting-edge Western restaurants. You can have real Western food if you want to. But this old-school Shanghainese Western food has really nothing to do with Westerners. And I've been to the restaurant many times, and I've never seen another foreigner there.
And based on China's modern history, how remarkable is it that this business has survived?
Chinese culture had such a tremendously turbulent time throughout most of the 20th century. So a restaurant like De Da, founded in 1897, has been through the overthrow of the imperial monarchy, Japanese invasion, civil war, the nationalization of industry when all private business was taken into government hands, and then the Cultural Revolution. And De Da was the same. So in the Cultural Revolution, it was forced to stop serving foreign food and had instead to change the menu to local fried buns and noodles, although I'm told that one of the chefs did keep a beef soup on the menu, which was a reference to its foreign origins. But it became a local restaurant, and at one point, it was even turned into a workshop which was packaging pills for a local hospital. And then it was only in 1973 that the restaurant was able to reopen and to start serving Western food again. So it's quite remarkable that through all these upheavals, it's still there and it still sort of maintains this old Shanghai atmosphere.
And you've talked to the chef. How does he see his role?
He sees it as his duty to maintain the traditional dishes, so he can make small innovations, but has to recognize that people in Shanghai come there for a taste of the past. So there are elderly people who go to the downstairs cafe for coffee, and they've been coming for decades. And also whole families who've been eating there for 2 or 3 generations now. But the really interesting thing is now there are young people, like I've met several young people dining there, who have no family connection, but they go there because they see it as part of their heritage, part of the old Shanghai style.
Food writer and author of Invitation to a Banquet, Fuchsia Dunlop. Does it matter if any of these restaurants disappear? In the UK alone, there are 40,000 restaurants, so why mourn the disappearance of a handful of centenarians? Let's go back to restaurateur Jeremy King, someone who sees great value in public spaces that possess special architecture, design, atmosphere and history. As I've mentioned, his career has involved restoring iconic London restaurants such as the Ivy in the 1990s and later this year, Simpson's. Big projects, all driven by a passion for unique buildings with stories to tell.
You have to be committed. And with landlords wanting to be able to take leases back after 10 years, it's harder to do it. The great leases, and what was the fundamental for the growth in restaurants in London, was that most leases were 25 years. And there was an act in 1954. No coincidence, I'm sure that it was the year of my birth, but it was the birth of restaurants because you couldn't eject people from the restaurants. You had an automatic right of renewal unless there was a development or complete development. So people did put the money in. And you only have to look at all the Grand Dame restaurants which have since disappeared to understand what they've been replaced by, to understand the paucity of real environment, a sense of history. And I think with historical restaurants, so much of it is subliminal, so much of it is about feeling what it might have been like in that period. And it's very rare that happens. I personally am always driven by the building, and it's no coincidence that the Wolsey, which was originally built as the Wolsey car showroom post First World War by an aspirational architect coming out of a period of terrible constraints and hardships, that they wanted to create that sort of environment just for a car showroom. It's remarkable when you think about it now and how functional architecture has become.
And just on a follow up a point you made earlier, you explained why this is happening in terms of the shorter leases. Can you expand a bit more on this idea of homogenization of whether it's architecture or restaurant design?
Well, I think it's because it's prevalent in all aspects of the world, in that you look into the film world, what you find as being pitched in Hollywood tends to be a version of something which was successful before, because people are scared of innovation. And nobody is really prepared to go out on a limb and risk money. And we have a good example, actually, strangely, would be in the world of baseball, where there's that book and film called Moneyball, and everything was based on statistics and results and statistics. And that may work in that world, but the world of restaurants has to be about instinct, subliminal enjoyment, a feel. And if we forget that, we create perfectly serviceable, perfectly adequate restaurants, but none which make your heart soar, which lift you when you walk through the door. And there's something about a good restaurant, just like buying or renting a flat or a house, you kind of know when you walk through the door that you want it, and it just be reinforced. And I think it's the same with a restaurant. And if you work with the building, use my design ethos on these buildings, which was very much the case before, is that if great design doesn't shout for attention, but it withstands scrutiny. And if you look at a lot of the old restaurants, yes, they may have soaring roofs and so on and so forth, but they're not screaming for attention with blingy gimmicks and so on. But it's the state of architecture now is getting worse and worse. I think the sad thing with today's architecture is too often people say, why bother? And there is a built-in obsolescence with buildings. We're already seeing buildings which were created 30, 40 years ago being taken down. Buildings tend to be functional. If you can make buildings functional and beautiful, then there's long-term savings, but we live in a world of short-term gain and expediency.